Hello and welcome to this lecture on the public-private partnerships in India. I am Abhinav Prakash Singh, Assistant Professor of Economics, Shri College of Commerce, University of Delhi. We are all aware about the debate which rages on in the field of economics, that what should be the role of the government in the economic development of a country. But we all agree, almost all of us do agree, that government should pay a special focus on building the infrastructure like ports, highways, railways and airports and other kinds of big infrastructure. There is an argument which says that if the government is funding all this infrastructure by its own resources, that leads to crowding out of the private investment. But there is another argument which says that instead of the crowding out, what we have in the economy is the crowding in. That is, when the government spends more money, when the government is running a higher fiscal deficit to build the infrastructure in the economy, that brings in the private investment because of the externality effects of that infrastructure. Whatever is the conclusion of this debate, that is not the matter of the discussion in this lecture. What is the matter of discussion in this lecture is how do we mobilize finances and the resources for building those infrastructure. Because while it is true that in the long run, because of the multiplier effect, the government may not find it difficult to fund this fiscal deficit, but in the short run there is a problem of resource mobilization. And to overcome that problem of resource mobilization, we often hear that the government is trying to bring in the private sector, the private companies in building of the infrastructure. But the privatization also has its own drawbacks, and many a time the private sectors are simply unwilling to undertake the big infrastructure project because of the low returns involved, long gestation period and the high risk in the project. As a result, what has been happening in the world for the last 20-30 years is a move towards the public-private partnerships in building the infrastructure. The public-private partnership lies somewhere between the complete or the total government provision of the infrastructure and the privatization. So, what do we have is we try to bring the best of the two worlds under this format and try to provide for the infrastructure to the public. So, what is infrastructure? The European Commission describes public-private partnership as a form of cooperation between the public authorities and economic operators. As you can see, it is a very wide, broad definition, because the public-private partnerships can have a lot under its ambit and there is no clear definition, there is no consensus on the definition around the world. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development defines a public-private partnership as an agreement between the government and one or more private partners, according to which the private partners deliver the service in such a manner that the service delivery objectives of the government are aligned with the profit objectives of the private partners, and where the effectiveness of the alignment depends on a sufficient transfer of risk to the private partners. The Asian Development Bank, on the other hand, terms public-private partnership as a range of possible relationships among public and private entities in the context of infrastructure and other services. It has three characteristics according to the ADB: a contractual agreement defining the role and responsibilities of both the parties, sensible risk sharing, and this is important, sensible risk sharing among the public and private sector partners, and the financial rewards to the private party commensurate with the achievements of the pre-specified output goals. In India, we define the public-private partnership as a project based on a contract or concession agreement between the government entity on the one hand and the private sector company on the other hand, for delivering an infrastructure service on payment of the user charges. This definition comes from the guidelines for the viability gap funding for the PPP projects of the Ministry of Finance. Whereas there is another definition which comes from the schemes and guidelines for India Infrastructure Project Development Fund, the Ministry of Finance, which says that the partnership between a public sector entity, which is the sponsoring authority, and a private sector entity, a legal entity in which 51% or more of equity is with the private partners, for the creation and management of infrastructure for public purpose for a specified period of time, which is called the concession period, on commercial terms, and in which the private partner has been procured through a transparent and open procurement system. So, by looking at these definitions, we can see that there are certain key characteristics of a public-private partnership. First, a PPP is a clearly defined project where government carefully defines its objectives. This is very important when you are building the contract for the PPP. What exactly do you want to achieve? Because if you are going to change the terms and conditions later on, then it leads to huge problems because there is another entity involved, the private entity, which may lead to complex financial negotiations, the renegotiation of the clause, which can lead to lots of delays and even the failure of the project. The second point is the contractual relationship spans a set length of time which may range from 50 to 30 years. So, the time period needs to be clearly defined as well in a PPP project. Number 3, the risks are allocated to the party most able to carry them out. This means mitigating their impact or being able to absorb the consequences. The risk allocation between the public sector and the private sector lies at the crux of the PPPs because that really defines whether the project is going to be a success or a failure. Number 4, the fixed and operational assets are adequately maintained over the project's lifetime. So, now because the infrastructure is being built by the private entity and the private entity also operates the infrastructure for a long period of time, think about a highway construction, a tolled highway construction, which means when you are handing back the infrastructure to the government, it needs to be maintained at a pre-specified level of operational effectiveness. Number 5, the private party plays a key role in each stage of project, from financing, from development to design to completion and implementation. So, even though the risks are shared between the government and the private sector entity, the private entity is supposed to take the lead role in the building of the infrastructure project. The payment arrangements in the PPPs are based on output related to provision of service and infrastructure or whatever services has been decided upon between the government and the private sector. It is important to note that the PPPs are not a way of avoiding payment for the capital projects. It is not that the government is trying to move out of the provision of the infrastructure projects. It basically says that the government can spread payments for large projects over a project's lifetime. So, the government is able to undertake simultaneously a number of projects if it can get involved a private sector entity and transfer some burden of implementation and financing of the project to the private entity. And how is the revenue stream decided by, on these projects? Normally, as we have seen that in the case of airways, in the case of highways and other places, is the user charges, right, the tolls like the advertisement fees and many other kinds of revenue generation avenues. Now, it is important to note that why are we moving towards the public-private partnerships? It basically started from the 1990s in a big way. The main argument in the favor of public-private partnership is very simple. It says that the government resources are limited. There is a limit to which the government can do deficit financing of the big projects. So, we need to build a mechanism in which we can mobilize resources from outside the government sector. So, basically the argument is that the government deficit cannot go beyond a point that will lead to other macroeconomic problems. So, we can try to rope in the private sector into building the big infrastructure project. And also there is an argument that the government often is not competent enough to build highly specialized infrastructure projects which can infuse the modern day technology with the international best practices. The other argument is that we really need to have an optimal risk allocation, because when the government is building the infrastructure project, as we have seen, it leads to lots of other kind of problems. There are political pressures, there are trade unions in the public sector units, there is this whole charges of corruption. So, it says that, well, if you want to deliver a good infrastructure to the public and simultaneously if you want to reduce the burden on the government on a specific infrastructure project, it is always better to have a partner which is a private sector entity which can also bring in some finances, some funding, some expertise and new technology and deliver the world class infrastructure to the public. But there are several arguments against the public private partnerships as well. Number one is that if you build this infrastructure using the PPP, who will be in the charge of the cost recovery from these projects? whose gains due to their public nature are often indivisible. Now, if you are building a highway and a highway in a region of the country, the gains which accrue from this highway sector is basically it has a public nature, it accrues to everyone. Now, if you want to recoup the charge of that highway, it becomes very difficult because of the externality effects. Do the toll charges capture all the benefit from the highways? And is it justified to impose tolls on the public, because that may lead to other cost and other distortions in the economy, because people are paying taxes ultimately to the government to provide them the roads and the highways. So, if you start charging them tolls, that is basically kind of a double taxation, people argue. And there are concerns regarding the viability and the effectiveness, especially in the big infrastructure project, which requires very large amount of investment for long period of time. Now, if you are building a highway or you are building a railway project, the sheer amount of investment required is of a very high magnitude. And it is not just of a very high magnitude, it takes a long period of time to deliver. And to able to provide you the positive returns, it takes even longer period of time. So, the point is that are these projects viable for the private entity or not? Will the private entity be willing to invest in a highway sector in a backward region of the country where your funds are locked in for a long period of time, the returns are very low if they are positive at all. So, these are the concerns against the PPPs. And these are also the adoption of the public private partnership route also tilts the balance against those projects which promote social benefits, not just economic benefit, right. Like the example which we have taken, the highway in a backward region of the country. Why would a private sector entity invest fund in a highway in a backward region of the country where the toll revenues will not be sufficient to cover the cost and the profit? And it also tilts the project against those kind of project in which it is very difficult to charge user charges, right. And it also creates a bias against those projects which may be of national importance, like building the big infrastructure might lead to the regional development over a longer period of time, but may not have immediate commercial gain or the economic gain. And also, if you look from the financing side, the capital expenditure on infrastructure is often indivisible and very large. Fixed charges form the major component of costs of providing the road services. Now, when the gains from a highway project, let us say, are calculated on a purely economic basis and accrue only to the users, and because let us assume there is no externality which is present, the toll rate cannot exceed the marginal benefit from the road services. But it leads to a situation where despite the tolling, the consumer surplus may be substantial. So, from the purely economic theory point of view, even the tolling is not able to capture the benefit which is accruing to the consumers. Now, even though the net economic benefits from the road project are positive, it may not be commercially viable for the private entity. Now, this leads to a tendency where the private investment is less than whatever is the optimal level required. So, we have seen that when you are building big infrastructure using the public private partnerships, there is a tendency for the private sector not to invest in the projects where there is low economic return, and there is a tendency for under provision of the infrastructure project if you rely on the private sector. So, what happens that the government is forced to enact the policies for neutralizing this bias in the private investment. So, what the government ends up doing is let us say it says I am going to provide you a portion of the funding of the projects which is called the viability gap funding, which is basically saying that this project is commercially unviable for the private sector entity, but we are going to fund let us say 40% of the cost upfront, which is the viability gap funding. And the government also says that, well, I am going to bear the cost of the project feasibility study, I am going to undertake the cost of the land acquisition, I am going to build all the amenities, I am going to get all the environment clearance, cutting of the trees, everything is my responsibility now. So, the government is saying that the private sector can only come and build the road infrastructure because I am also willing to share the burden of the cost of such infrastructure. And it also leads to other kind of government schemes, like the government starts providing tax exemptions, it starts providing duty free imports for the equipment, the rule for borrowing abroad are relaxed for the companies and the banks and the financial institutions, and the tax exemptions are also given to the financiers of the private company. Now, all these things means what basically? See, the main argument in the favor of the PPP was that you wanted to reduce the burden, the fiscal burden on the government. But now you have been forced to provide lots of fundings and exemptions and even the viability cap funding to the private sector. Then what exactly is the purpose of the PPP? Doesn't it negate the argument in the favor of the PPP that the public-private partnership will reduce the fiscal burden on the government funds? And what about the distortionary effect which such kind of exemptions lead to? Like you are providing tax exemptions, you are providing duty-free imports of certain equipments, that leads to distortions in the economy because you are playing with the market rates in the economy. Now, which means there is a erosion of the allocative efficiency, and there is an increase in the deadweight loss for the economy on a whole. But we will come back to this kind of problems when we are discussing the highways construction in India specifically. But before that, let us have a look at the risks in the public-private partnership. What kind of risks do we have when we have a PPP model adopted for building infrastructure? First risk is the pre-operative risk, which is the risk of delay in land construction, delay in the land acquisition. There are the risk of the financing, that you are unable to achieve the financial closure, unable to mobilize funds for the project, and their planning risk. What if the planning itself is flawed, that leads to the unraveling of the entire project later on? Number second are the construction phase risks, which are basically the design risk, the construction risk, approval risk, additional site, additional requirement which may crop up during the phase of the construction. Then we have operation phase risks, which basically are technology risk, operation and maintenance risk, the traffic risk, the payment risk, and again the financial risk, that is basically the private entity has to pay back the funds which it has mobilized and borrowed from the banks and the financial institutions. Then there are handover risk. What happens when the private sector entity is handing over the infrastructure project back to the government sector? What is the condition of the infrastructure projects? And we have various other kinds of things, that what if the private entity says that I have not been able to recoup my cost of construction. And there are other kinds of risks, like there are event of default by the government, or if the private sector company went bankrupt. Now, these risks are very important, because when you are framing, when you are drawing up the contract for the public-private partnership, you have to specify very clearly which party is going to bear what kind of risk. Like who will bear the risk of the design, who is going to bear the risk of the delay in the land acquisition, who is going to bear the risk if there is not enough user charge collection and the project never becomes profitable, what will be the mode of settlement, what will be the way in which these the issues which may crop up in the future. Let us say if the company defaults, or if the government is unable to honor its own commitments, then how do you resolve? The conflict resolution becomes a very important thing. So, the clearly defined risk allocation lies at the heart of a PPP project. But what kind of PPP models do we have? We have different kinds of PPP models which have different kinds of requirements on the part of the private sector and have different kinds of risk allocation. The most commonly seen, the most commonly used PPP model is called build, operate and transfer, that is called the BOT model. Under this category, the private partner is responsible for designing, building, operating and transferring back the facility to the public sector. The private sector partner is expected to bring the finance for the project, take the responsibility of the construction and maintain it. The public sector will either pay a rent for using the facility or allow it to collect revenue from the users. The national highway projects contracted out by the NHAI, that is the National Highway Authority of India, under the PPP mode is a very prime example. Then you have a model which is called the lease, operate and transfer, which is called LOT model. Under it, a facility which already exists and is under operation is entrusted to the private sector partner for operation and maintenance, subject to terms and conditions decided by the mutual agreement. The contract will be for a given but sufficiently long period of time, and the asset in the end will be transferred back to the government when the contract ends. The leasing a school building or a hospital or a private sector along with the staff and all the facilities by entrusting it with the management and control subject to predetermined condition could come under this kind of category. And then you have a variant of the BOT model, which is called build, own, operate, or own, operate and transfer model. This is a variation of the BOT model, except that the ownership of the newly built facility will rest with the private party during the period of the contract. And there are various other kinds of model like design, build, finance, operate, or design, build, finance, operate and maintain. The name itself tells you what are the liabilities and the responsibilities of the private sector and the government sector in these cases. So, they can be, depending upon the risk allocation, different kinds of public-private partnerships model adopted by the government, and the real thing is that in which kind of model who is bearing the most risk. Like in the BOT, the risk to the private sector is far greater than, let us say, in the case of a simple service contract, right, that you are simply outsourcing certain services to the private sector. That is also a PPP model, but in that the risk to the private sector is low, the risk borne by the government is higher. Whereas if you do a highway construction using the build, operate and toll model, you are transferring the risk of the building the highway, operating the highway and the toll collection from the highway to the private sector, which means the risk allocation has now tilted in favor of the private sector, in favor of the public sector, and the private sector is bearing most of the risk. Now, we are going to see that how this PPP models actually works in the case of big infra like highways in India. Now, the case of highway construction is very interesting, because in India we see that the PPP model has been adopted to a large extent and in a great manner in the building of the highways in India. Now, National Highway Development Program launched by the NHAI, and later on you have the Sagarmala, Bharatmala projects, all of them are going via the PPP route in some form or the other. The case of highway construction is important, because if we see the case where the government is building all the highways, it leads to certain complications. One is obviously the resource mobilization. You have to build thousands and thousands kilometers of the highways and expressway. It becomes very difficult for the government to provide for them from the budgetary allocation. Now, two most common problems faced by the government's provision of road infrastructure are of overestimating demand and underestimating the cost. It always happens in every kind of public sector undertaking, that you overestimate the public demand for that infrastructure. There is tendency to build white elephants, that is the infrastructure which is not required. Look at your neighboring country China, they have built so much of infrastructure that it is leading to the problem, because there is no demand for those infrastructure. And the government sector often tends to underestimate the cost. It does not, for some reason that the public sector projects by experience have been found unable to do a proper cost estimation. And there is also the problem of flawed selection due to political compulsions to cater to powerful political constituencies, which can lead to the project that have less than the desired or negative social value. So, if you are a politician, if you are the government who is deciding the which highways to be built and where it is to be built, there is a tendency to skew the allotment of the highways to the constituency from where the government is getting the maximum support. Because the government has only so much amount of resources to invest, it tends to prioritize its own political constituency to the neglect of the other regions in the country. There are more political pressures of building the highways, because you may ally up with different parties. They may say, give us this project because we have to show our constituency that we have got something from the government, even though that highway or that road is not required in that region, because you already have good enough road. And it also leads to a problem, because See, because if you're building new highway or new road, that is often more rewarding because you can show to the public that you have built something new. It also leads to what you say, the charges of corruption, that if you're building big infrastructure like road highways, there are more possibilities of doing corruption and making money by different agents involved. So what happens is that under the PPP model, under the government sector provision of the road sector, roadways, there is a tendency to build new highways even though it is not required, rather than spending on maintenance of the old road networks. And then there is another problem with the highway sector because it has a characteristic of a public good. So, it is not possible for the government to prevent congestion or overuse, and the government finds it very difficult to impose the user charges on the highways because of obvious political reasons. Therefore, we see that in India, there has been a shift towards the adoption of the PPP in the roadways sector from the 90s itself. A slow shift which became very profound when the NDA-1 launched the National Highway Development Program. This massive project of constructing highways and roadways across the country gave a flip to the PPP model in the country. In India, we normally use two kinds of PPP models for the highway construction. One is called the BOT toll, that is the build, operate, toll model, in which it is, as we have seen earlier, it is the responsibility of the private sector to build a road, operate it, maintain it for a fixed period and recover expenditure involved in building, operating and maintenance, including the interest and the profit by the way of the collection of the toll revenue. The toll rates are updated based on the WPI, and on the completion of the concession period, the project highway is handed back to the government at no cost. The risk of construction, maintenance, operation and revenue generation lies entirely with the private sector partner. The government role is restricted in theory to project preparation and pre-construction activities. In BOT toll projects, the decision making is faster compared to the other kinds of models you can think of, like the old way of EPC, which is called engineering, procurement and construction, or forming a special purpose vehicle to undertake that project. In the BOT toll model, there are incentives to ensure quality construction in order to minimize the cost and to minimize the operation and maintenance expenditure later on, because it is the private sector itself who has to look over the maintenance of the project for a long period of time, and which means that the private partner has an incentive to bring in the latest technology, it has incentive to use the latest kind of construction methods, it has incentive to reduce the life cycle cost of the project, which leads to a project being created which is cost efficient in theory and which is of a international standard, a world class standard. And how does the government exercise oversight over this kind of project is by appointing an independent consultant who supervise the day-to-day activities. So, the government's intervention is minimized. The typical bureaucratic meddling with the project is also minimized because supervision is outsourced to a competent authority which is an independent consultant. The other kind of project which is used in India for the provision of the public sector, for the provision of the road and highway sector is the BOT Annuity model, which is build, operate, toll model, but instead of toll collection, the private sector receive an annuity payment from the government at fixed intervals. The government pays fixed sums to the private entity normally at the end of the 6th month to make him recover his investment. If there is some kind of toll collection, the toll collections goes to the government, but not to the private sector. The rewards or the returns of the private sectors is fixed by the government via the annuity payment. As you can see in this case, the major risk of revenue generation, that is the traffic risk, is now with the government and not with the private sector. Unlike the BOT toll model, where the whole the risk of the revenue stream by the toll collection over the period of the concession was with the private sector, now the government has taken over this risk. Why is that so? Because there are many areas in the country where the traffic flow might not be very great. Now, if you are building a road or a highway near the metropolitan city, all in an industrial area, the private sector will be more than willing to come and invest, because the forecast of the toll revenue will be very high, because the traffic is already very high, it is expected to increase over the period of time. But if you are building a highway in a village area which is passing through the backward regions of the country, the private sector would not be willing to come, because the toll revenue projection would be very small or even negative. So, BOT Annuity model is adopted in those cases, so as to invite the private player, but to take away the significant risk of the revenue generation from the private sector, and the government says, I am going to pay you a fixed amount every 6 months or so. So, we have seen that the government has adopted the public-private partnerships as the mode or the mechanism for providing highway and the roadways to the country. But the experience over the last 2 decades have shown that this model or this route has not been very successful. There are various problems in the PPPs in the highway construction. Number one is what we have seen earlier, that what we see in actual practice, that is the government which ends up bearing most of the cost of the project, right. So, in the PPP model, the main argument is that the government is able to reduce its fiscal commitment, because the private sector is also expected to mobilize the funding and the resources. But then we see that the government provides viability gap funding. Around 40% of the cost of the project is directly provided by the government. And not only that, there are lots of pre-construction cost, like the land clearance, the land acquisition, the building, the resettlement of the people, which normally falls on the government itself. So, you see it is not surprising to see a project in which, let us say, the cost of the project was 700 crore, of which 40% is being provided by the government, but the project has a 500 crore pre-construction cost, which is borne entirely by the government. So, it leads to a problem that what kind of private contribution do we have in this kind of highway construction. And these concessions obviously are aimed at reducing the revenue risk from the inadequate traffic, which negates the whole point of preferring the public-private partnership through the BOT toll model. And in the case of Annuity model, we have seen that already the private sector is taking over all the risk and dumping it on the government. So, the government bears all the risk in that case. The concession period is often fixed for a longer period of time, that is warranted by the cost and estimated returns involved. So, what happens in the actual practice is that, because if it is a BOT toll model, the private sector can recoup all the profit and the cost and the interest using the toll revenue. If it is the Annuity model, the government is guaranteeing you a return. So, in practice, we have seen that it reduces the incentive to use the cost effective technology and the construction methods, and it actually gives an incentive to inflate the cost of the project, because whatever you spend you can recoup in the way of the profit. So, there is an incentive for inflation of the cost under the PPP project. Now, the excuse for low cost efficiency, maintenance, whatever be the cost, can be recovered through the user charges. So, it leads to inefficiency in the provision of the highway or the roadways. And it also leads to a problem, because on paper the government is abdicating the responsibilities, right. You are not building the highway, you are not maintaining it, you are not ensuring the standards of quality and rules, because you have outsourced all your day-to-day work to an independent consultant, which itself is a private sector entity, and we do not know what kind of relationship that independent consultant might have with the private company who is building the highway. Now, annuity payments create another kind of problem, right, because they create a long-term demand on the fiscal position of the government. Often it does not have a revenue stream and is dependent upon the budgetary allocation. So, you say that, well, it is a backward reason, so the private sector can come and build the highways, and we are going to pay you fixed amount every 6 months. Basically, you are giving a guaranteed return to the private sector, and it is going to create a long-term demand on the fiscal position of the government, which leads to the problem, because that negates the argument that the PPP model eases the fiscal position of the government, right. And then there are problems that of the land use, right. So, you are handing over the land to the private player at no cost, and it is often seen that the private players demand the user development rights. So, if you are giving the land to the private sector for building the roadways and the highways, not only that, you often give extra land to them near the highways for commercial development, which is something which is ethically wrong and which is also economically wrong, because that land could have been used by the government for the commercial development itself, or the land which was acquired from the people, they could have used it for their commercial gains in the future once the highway is built. Now, it also creates another important problem, is that PPPs have become a mean to take off several government expenditures off the budget and present a rosy picture of the government's fiscal health. Right. So, you are saying that the government is not building these highways, is the public sector, is the private sector which is building it, most of the resources and the finances. But as we have seen that in the end, the government ends up guaranteeing the return, sharing the cost of construction and funding fully the pre-construction cost, but these costs are not shown in the budget of the government. So, your budgetary fiscal deficit is lower than what your actual fiscal liabilities are, and this has severe macroeconomic complications. And we have also seen that when you are building the highways using the PPP model, the private sector is very sure of inserting a renegotiation clause in the case of lower than expected profit. In the case of Delhi-Noida toll bridge, Delhi-Gurgaon expressway, these problems were encountered, and that led to lots of legal cases, court cases, and lots of loss to the economy. So, the private sector basically says that if my profits are lower than expected, if I build this road and charge tolls, I am going to renegotiate the clause, right. And it also is very sure to insert no competition clause. So, the private sector says that if I am building this highway, so for the next 10 or 15 years, no competing transport facility can be built in the vicinity of this highway. Now, this is basically creating a monopoly for the private sector, essentially on the public funding. And the risk allocation and the moral hazard problem is not really resolved by the PPP in the actual practice, because we have seen both in the BOT toll model and the annuity model, and also the way the contracts are drawn up, like no competition clause, renegotiation clause, guaranteed profit. It basically means that in the end all the risk falls upon the government sector, and there is a big problem of moral hazard on the part of the private entity. So, here is a graph which shows the sections of the completed highways by the mode of financing. This is basically the National Highway Development Program under the National Highway Authority of India. As you can see, in the first phase and the second phase, most of the PPP was used via the what you call the EPC contract, where the government simply contracts out the highway construction to the private sector. This was because even though the government launched the PPP model with great fanfare and all, the private investments were not coming in, because of the reasons we have seen earlier, that these kind of projects, the big infra projects, are not really the area in which the private sector would want to invest. So, what happened that the government started changing its policy and started giving out those exemptions, viability cap funding, which we have all seen. So, the private investment started coming into the PPP model. So, from the phase 3 and phase 5 and 4, we see a huge increase in the share of the BOT toll model in the model adopted for the construction of the highways. But what has happened over time is that lots of these projects started to fail. Lots of these projects started to be abandoned by the private sector, because of the very fact that the building of the highways and expressway requires huge amount of investment, the returns are low, and there is a limit to which you can charge the tolls on the users, because we have seen how it has led to the political problems in several states, where the people have been attacking the toll booths, because they say that it has been years after years that the tolls are being charged, and the private sector has never been able to recoup the profit it has made, profit it was supposed to make on those roadways or on those highways. So, what has happened is that The second graph shows you that the PPP model have not been performing very well. So, there is a shift backward towards the what you call the old style model, which is the EPC model, the engineering, procurement and construction. So, you see from 1996 to 2005, the PPP model was really not the talk of the town. In 2002, the National Highway Development Program starts. You have a spurt in the, you have a small spurt in the PPP models, basically the BOT annuity model. Then you are back to the old way of construction of the highways. And from 2006, after you come out with a new kind of guidelines in which you are giving exemptions and all, there is a huge jump in the share of the PPP models in the construction of the highways. But from 2013, you see again you are back to the old way of constructing the highways. What does this graph tell you? This is a very important graph. It basically says that the government and the policy makers have overestimated the interest of the private sector into the PPP model. Why is that so? Because they thought that if they give the toll revenues to the private sector, they will be willing to invest. But by very nature of the highway construction and the big infrastructure projects, these areas are not really preferred by the private sector. The private sector came before the financial crisis. There was huge investment because the private sector had lots of funds to invest. The banks were lending out recklessly. So, they started investing in India in the highway construction sector, but very soon they realized that this is not going to work. Even after so much of concessions, viability gap funding, exemptions and everything by the government, these projects, these highways were not commercially and economically viable on a profit making basis. So, what happens that this private sector simply started abandoning the project or filing for bankruptcy. And then you have a huge problem from the 2011 and 12, where the highway construction under the NHDP virtually comes to a standstill. We all remember the talk of the talk in the newspapers and the daily reports that the highway construction has hit the lowest ever rate. Why was that happening? Because the PPP models had failed. So, what happens from the 2013, the government takes another decision and says, well, we are not going to go for the PPP model anymore. If the private sector is not coming, not bidding for the project, we are going to adopt the old route, which is the EPC route, in which even if you are hiring the private sector, we are simply paying him upfront money, asking the private sector to build the road under the EPC model and take over the roadways and operate it ourselves. What is happening is that since then we see a huge shift in the mechanism adopted for building the highways, right. So, the PPP model has been dropped by the government, and government has moved towards something called the hybrid annuity model and the EPC contract model. Hybrid annuity model is basically a variant of the BOT annuity model, where you mix the characteristics of the EPC contract and the BOT annuity model. It is very simple, it is not very difficult, it has been recently adopted. So, we do not know how successful it is going to be, but under the hybrid annuity model, what does the government does is that for any PPP project, the government will contribute 40% of the cost in the first 5 years through annuity payment. The remaining payment will be made once the project is completed by the private player, and the private player is expected to mobilize the remaining 60% in the meanwhile, which will be paid to it later on by the government using the annuity model. Now, there is no right for toll collection for the developer. The revenue collection goes to the NHAI, and NHAI is the one which takes all the responsibility of the revenue collection. How successful this new kind of PPP model is going to be is a question which will be answered in the coming few years. But it brings us to the fundamental question, is the PPP the best way to build highways and the big infrastructure in the country? Now, there are arguments in favor of PPPs, but the way in which we have implemented PPPs in India is not something which can be continued for the coming years. The government needs to drop the PPPs as the default mode for building the road infrastructure. We have seen that it was a policy decision to give the contracts to the private sector even if that meant changing the parameters of the project. So, the government itself was manipulating the the parameters of the project, changing the scope of the project, so as to make it commercially viable for the private sector. That was so because the government has taken a decision that we will adopt PPP as a default mode of delivery of the highway constructions. So, the government needs to drop that default mode. The government can invite the private investment through the PPPs, but concession should be given only for some essential services like land acquisition and all. Beyond that, the government should say, we are not going to give you any concession, any tax exemption, any viability gap funding. If the private sector is willing to take up the project, that is good enough. But if the private sector is not willing to take up the project, the government should take the project on its own using the deficit financing. Because once you make the provision of the big infrastructure dependent upon the private sector, you have to change the policies to suit the private sector, which means you have to, in the end, you end up offering guaranteed returns and guaranteed profits to the private sector, which is basically not only economically wrong, but also ethically wrong. And it also a problematic thing to do, because if you can guarantee profits to a private sector by spending so much of money, why can't you simply let the public sector do this work? So, what we need to do is that we need to create new models in which we can bring in the private sector expertise and experience and technology, but without these PPP models which end up government bearing all the risk. So, we have to wait and watch how this PPP stories folds out or spans in the future, but I must point it out here that South Asia is the reason, apart from the Latin America, where the PPPs have been adopted for the provision of the big infrastructure. It has not worked in America, it has not worked in Europe, it has certainly not worked in the Africa. It has not worked in the, it has not been very successful in the Korea and other places. In India, it has been adopted not because of its proven superiority over the public provision of the highway construction and the big infrastructure, but simply because there was a policy decision to push through the PPP projects. Thank you.